Well, thank you, Paula. And I have to give Paula credit for tonight's topic. Or if it turns out you don't like the presentation, she can take the blame for it. But Paula had suggested that I choose a topic that would commemorate the sesquicentennial 150th anniversary in 1864. Happened to be the year, and I'd always wanted to do a talk on Atlanta. But I didn't want to just do it from the perspective of the commanders on the Federal and Confederate side, Generals Johnston and Sherman. I wanted to take a somewhat different view. And what I did was I looked at the forces from the Eastern Theater that moved west in the fall of 1863. And I looked at the two senior commanders, General Joseph Hooker and General Oliver O. Howard. And I wanted to see what it was like for these two generals who had served in a theater where the Union forces knew mostly defeat, moving into the Western Theater where the Union forces there had known mostly victory. And I'm sure they saw this as a great opportunity, not only for personal advancement, but for redemption of sorts, to maybe right some wrongs that were left unresolved when they left the Virginia Theater in 1863. So we're going to start off with General Joseph Hooker. We'll go to the next slide. Hooker was born in Hadley, Massachusetts in 1814. He graduated from West Point in 1837, the middle of his class. Not the greatest of scholars, but from the beginning he proved to be an aggressive warrior, both in the Second Seminole War and in the Mexican War. Hooker decided to resign from the Army in 1854 after he had testified against the U.S. Army's General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, who made things so difficult for him. He decided to try his hand first in farming and then in land speculation in California. Proved to be a resounding failure in both. It sounds like a familiar story with other Union generals we shall leave unnamed. Hooker finally received his opportunity after the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, and he secured a commission as Brigadier General in the Union Army. In 1862, he was a division commander in the Peninsula Campaign, where he received his nickname, and as the questionnaire asked, true or false, was that a nickname that Hooker liked? Absolutely not. He once said that it made him sound like he was an outlaw. But thanks to a typographical error in a newspaper that read, it was supposed to read, Fighting Dash Joe Hooker, the dash was dropped, and Hooker received his nickname, like it or not. Well, Hooker rose to Corps Command in the Battle of Antietam, was wounded in the foot there. I should point out that he was recognized as an aggressive general, very effective as a battlefield commander, but he had one serious flaw. He was mercilessly critical of his superiors. The higher up the chain of command they were, the better. He felt that George McClellan, his commander in the Army of the Potomac, was not a true soldier, was not qualified to command that army, and he said so in no uncertain terms, made his feelings very well known. Later that year, in December of 1862, when McClellan's replacement, Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, launched his disastrous assault at Fredericksburg, Hooker lashed out at him as well, called him incompetent. Burnside would have replaced him and a host of other generals if he'd had the opportunity. But he was replaced by none other than Joseph Hooker. Next slide. And we'll defer Hooker's story for just a minute because I'd like to talk about the other subject in this presentation, General Oliver O. Howard. Now, Howard was born in Leeds, Maine in 1830, went to Bowdoin College, graduated there, and then moved on to West Point, where he graduated fourth in his class in 1854. Now, Howard went on to serve in the Third Seminole War, and it was there that he received his rebirth. He became an evangelical Christian, hence his nickname, the Christian Soldier. His men also called him behind his back, Old Prayer Book. Religion was not really popular in the old army, And Howard was a very rare individual, fiercely religious. He was also brave, almost to a fault, a quality that he shared with Joe Hooker. And at the Battle of Fair Oaks on May 31, 1862, during the Peninsula Campaign, he was severely wounded in the right arm, hence his empty sleeve. Hooker moved up steadily. By the spring of 1863, he was commanding a division in Hooker's Army of the Potomac. Incidentally, I want to give Hooker a little credit at this point. The Army of the Potomac was probably a low ebb following the Fredericksburg campaign with the disastrous battle and then followed by the Mud March in early 1863. And it was up to Hooker to rebuild that army, and he did so from the ground up. First, to restore the morale, he instituted a liberal system of furloughs, offered amnesty to deserters. And second, to bolster esprit de corps, he introduced corps badges. And these badges were mostly geometric symbols. Didn't look like they were much consequence. They went on the soldier's cap or on the lapel. But by the summer of 1863, there were men who were willing to die for the sake of their corps and that symbol, that badge. And then finally, Joe Hooker also concentrated his cavalry into one corps to put it on a parity with the Confederate cavalry, which up to this time had been vastly superior. So Hooker is a very impressive administrator and logistician. He has this army finally restored to fighting trim in the spring of 1863, and he sets out to defeat Lee in the wilderness at a place called Chancellorsville. Next slide. Now I should point out that Howard is also ambitious, just like Hooker. He wants to move up the chain. But when Hooker appoints General Dan Sickles to the command of the 3rd Corps, Howard is furious. He's senior to Sickles. And he demands a corps command. Well, he gets it. The 11th Corps, which had been under the illustrious German-American soldier, Major General Franz Sigel. Now, the motto of the soldiers in Sigel's 11th Corps, and keep in mind, roughly half of them are German immigrants. But their rallying cry is, "I fight mit Siegel," not Oliver O. Howard. And Howard is not the most inspiring of figures. Unlike Hooker or General Winfield Scott Hancock, who really cut a fine figure on horseback and know just what to say and when to say it, Howard tends to be soft-spoken. He speaks in a high, squeaky voice. Not the most inspiring man on the battlefield, but that's who's commanding the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville. Now, Hooker starts out moving aggressively and succeeds in getting on Lee's flank. He doesn't know it, but he outnumbers Lee roughly 2-1. Lee has almost an entire corps on detached service. He has only one corps commander, one reliable corps commander, but it's the one he needs, Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. And when Hooker decides to stop and invite Lee to attack him, Lee takes him up on the offer. He and Jackson work out a plan in which Jackson will attack, strike the right flank of the Federal force, roll up the Federal line, panic the troops, and drive them off the field and win the day. Well, Jackson begins his march early on the morning of the 2nd of May, 1863, and Hooker sends couriers to Howard, who's on the right, warning him of an expected flank attack. In fact, some of Howard's subordinates are sending him messages saying that there is word of a flanking force moving in his direction. What does Howard do? Well, he doesn't dig in. He doesn't send out skirmishers to probe his right flank. He doesn't send out pickets. As a result, late on the afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1863, the Confederates strike Howard's right flank. Next slide. And the result is chaos. The Germans of Sigel's 11th Corps are sent flying in retreat. resulting in Lee's greatest victory, the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Federals of the 11th Corps are nicknamed the Flying Dutchman, or even less charitably, Howard's Cowards. Hooker is furious. He holds Howard responsible for his defeat at Chancellorsville. He'll never forgive him for it. But he's stuck with him for the time being. Next slide. And this is what the flank attack looks like. We'll move on to the next slide. Now Lee decides that the Battle of Chancellorsville, although it's a great tactical victory, achieved next to nothing on a strategic level. It's left the two armies glowering at each other across the Rappahannock River. So Lee decides he's going to launch his second invasion of the North and strike into Pennsylvania, take the war to the Union Army, and perhaps end it in a lightning campaign that summer. Now Hooker is responsible for covering Washington, the national capital, and Baltimore. But he tells President Lincoln, I think we have an opportunity here. I'm going to head south and capture Richmond while Lee is heading north. And Lincoln points out to him, well, that's probably not such a good idea since Lee's going to be invading northern soil and threatening the U.S. Capitol. Your objective is Lee's army, not the Confederate capital. But I have a feeling at this point, Hooker has had enough of Bobby Lee. And I think he wants out. Now, he's claimed that he is outnumbered, heavily outnumbered by Lee's army, when in fact, the Army of the Potomac numbers roughly 90,000 at this point. The Lee has probably 75,000 troops at most. But on June the 27th, Hooker issues an ultimatum to Lincoln. You either send me reinforcements or replace me. Well, Lincoln calls Hooker's bluff, and on the 28th of June, he appoints George Meade to command the Army of the Potomac, and he replaces Hooker. Next slide. Now, a few days later, on the 1st of July, 1863, Confederates and the Federals fight the first day at Gettysburg. The Confederates win the race to Gettysburg. And guess whose force is out on the Union right flank north of town? Yep, that's right, Howard and his 11th Corps. And I'll give you 3 guesses of what happens. Confederates outflank the 11th Corps and send it flying through the streets of Gettysburg and retreat. The Flying Dutchmen have done it again. Next slide. Fortunately, Howard had the foresight to leave one of his divisions under von Steinwehr on Cemetery Hill. And it's there that he will form his forces. And that's where the fishhook line will essentially begin, there at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. So even though Howard has lost the day north of town, he has at least created an opportunity for General Meade when he arrives at Gettysburg to form a line on Cemetery Ridge. On Cemetery Ridge. Next slide. Now the opportunity for redemption comes in the fall of 1863. The Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia is fought from September 18th through the 20th. Results in the Army of the Cumberland's first and only major defeat. That army is sent fleeing into Chattanooga, where they're soon besieged by the Confederates under the command of General Braxton Bragg. The commander of the Army of the Cumberland is General Rosecrans. And in Lincoln's words, it appears that Rosecrans is like a duck that's been hit over the head. He's confused. He's thrown off balance. His army is besieged. They're barely eking out sustenance because the supply lines have been cut off. So now on September the 23rd, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton decides he has to do something quickly. First, he sends Major General Ulysses S. Grant with the Army of the Tennessee under the command of General William T. Sherman eastward to Chattanooga, and he sends 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac, the 11th Corps under Howard and the 12th Corps under Slocum, under none other than Joe Hooker, sends them westward in the most impressive rail transfer of the war. This railroad transfer involves taking over 25,000 Union troops with their supplies, their wagons, their artillery, their horses, taking them 1,200 miles over 5 different civilian railroads. And in less than a month, they put that force at Bridgeport and Stevenson, Alabama, in position to aid the Army of the Cumberland. Next slide. The Cracker Line is opened at Brown's Ferry on the 28th of October. Bragg decides to launch a counterattack and try to seize that point. He places his fierce rival and much hated subordinate Lieutenant General James Longstreet in command. Now, Longstreet commands 2 divisions of his corps from the Army of Northern Virginia, and they helped to tip the balance at Chickamauga, but since then, Longstreet has been a thorn in Bragg's side. He's been maneuvering to try to take command away from him. And it's here that Longstreet would have a real opportunity, because Joe Hooker has done a terrible job of deploying his troops along the railroad east of Brown's Ferry. They're scattered as if they're not facing an enemy. They're just going into camp. Now Longstreet decides to attack at 2 different points, at Wauhatchie and to the north, where Howard is deployed with troops of the 11th Corps, 12th Corps to the south. Instead of sending in his full force, as Bragg had recommended, Longstreet sends in merely 1 division, Hood's old division under Brigadier General Micah Jenkins to the south, striking the 12th Corps, Geary's division, and 1 brigade under Evander Law, striking Howard's 11th Corps. Now, through miscommunication, oh, by the way, I should also point out, this is one of those rare occurrences on a Civil War battlefield. This is a night battle. It takes place just after midnight on the 29th of October, to add further to the fog of war. While Law is attacking Howard's troops, he receives word that Bratton's brigade to the south has fallen back. So Law pulls back. What he doesn't realize is that Bratton is about to break through the Federal line there. But now, Howard's troops head south down the railroad and relieve General Geary of his predicament and drive off Bratton's brigade. So, by just plain good fortune, Hooker is saved at Wauhatchie. However, General Grant is not at all impressed with Hooker's tactical dispositions. He comes very close to replacing him after Wauhatchie. And in effect, Hooker is going to start out with 2 strikes against him. Grant doesn't particularly like him. He's not impressed. And Hooker's big mouth is going to get him into trouble more than once in the course of the Chattanooga and Atlanta campaigns. Next slide. But perhaps Hooker's finest hour occurs at Lookout Mountain on the 25th of November, 1863. Hooker is put there to demonstrate against the Confederates. And in an order that sounds very similar to the order that Lee had given to General Buell to take Cemetery Hill if practicable, he says that if his operation at Lookout Mountain appears to be a success, to take that mountain if practicable. And Hooker does just that. Next slide. He sends Geary's division across to the right of Lookout Mountain, driving back the Confederate troops holding that position. The rest of his task force follows. He captures Lookout Mountain, which by the afternoon of that day is covered in fog. And that's why it will be nicknamed the Battle Above the Clouds. Next slide. Then on the 25th of November, Grant wants to launch his knockout punch. He's going to send his favorite subordinate, General Sherman, and his 15th Corps to attack the Confederate Reich. Next slide. And it's Sherman who has the task of driving off the Confederates from Missionary Ridge and lifting the siege of Chattanooga. But Sherman runs into trouble. He only sends 3 brigades in his attack, and they're facing the finest combat division in the Army of Tennessee under the command of Major General Patrick R. Cleburne, and they are repulsed with heavy losses. In the meantime, Hooker is to launch a sweeping attack on the left flank of the Confederate force into Breckinridge's corps. Hooker has somewhat more success than Sherman, and he succeeds in driving back the Confederates, including in capturing 700 men of Holtzclaw's brigade. In the meantime, the Army of the Cumberland, who've been having to put up with the jeers and taunts of the 15th Corps and the 12th and 11th Corps troops, are to launch a mere feint along the base of Missionary Ridge, just to keep the Confederates occupied, and in Grant's orders to move no farther than the rifle pits once they've captured them. But once General George Thomas's troops, the Army of the Cumberland, reach that point, they're taking heavy fire from the Confederates. The soldiers, and maybe some of the lower-ranking officers, decide that it's either to fall back or charge up that hill. And that's what they do. They launch an attack. Grant can't believe his eyes. He said, "Who ordered that? Not me." And Thomas said, "I'm just as surprised as you are." But it's that unplanned attack that ends up carrying Missionary Ridge, driving the Confederates back in confusion. However, there's one division that retains its cohesion. And you can just imagine which division that is. Next slide. Now, after Hooker is broken through at Rossville Gap, he reaches Ringgold Gap, and that's where General Patrick R. Cleburne's division is going to fight a delaying action to buy time for Bragg's disorganized army to fall back into Georgia. Next slide. Hooker launches a frontal assault. Cleburne's division refuses to budge. He strikes both flanks. In the process, he takes heavy casualties. And then Cleburne falls back once the Army of Tennessee is safely withdrawn. Next slide. But after that debacle, General Bragg resigns his command of the Army of Tennessee, and he's replaced by General Joseph E. Johnston. Also, in March of 1864, General Grant is promoted to General-in-Chief of the Union armies and promoted to Lieutenant General. And he decides to head east to take on General Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. He'll leave his trusted subordinate, General Sherman, in command of the military division of the Mississippi. He'll command a 3-army group. The Army of the Cumberland under General Thomas, the Army of the Tennessee under General James B. McPherson, and finally the Army of the Ohio under General John M. Schofield, roughly 106,000 troops. Johnston will have at most roughly 75,000 troops to oppose Sherman with. Now the two generals, Grant and Sherman, plan their attack at the Burnett House in Cincinnati, Ohio. Grant will attack Lee's army, drive toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, while Sherman launches his advance on Atlanta, Georgia, the Deep South's largest rail and manufacturing center. And he will attack Johnston's army. And by this means, they'll prevent the Confederates from reinforcing each other as they had done in 1863. In the meantime, General Hooker is placed in command of the 20th Corps, which is actually the 11th and 12th Corps concentrated into a single fighting unit. General Howard, I'm sure much to his relief, is put in command of the 4th Corps in the Army of the Cumberland. Next slide. And Howard will be serving under Major General George H. Thomas. He's going to find a very different climate in the Western armies. He's really been looked upon almost as something of a joke in the Army of the Potomac. But when he arrives in the Western theater, he makes a very strong first impression on General Grant and on an equally strong impression on his commanding officer, General Thomas, which will stand him in good stead. So now we have two generals who are probably on the verge of being relieved from command, or certainly General Howard at the end of the Gettysburg campaign, are now seeing their opportunities improve in the Western theater. Next slide. Now, at the beginning of the Atlanta campaign, early May of 1864, General Sherman decides to launch an attack deep into the rear of Johnston's army through a gap, Snake Creek Gap. He sends General McPherson's entire Army of the Tennessee. The plan is to cut off Johnston's retreat, advance up the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which is Johnston's lifeline to Atlanta, and surround him, forcing Johnston to fight in the open. And in one big battle, Sherman will be able to end the Atlanta campaign with a resounding victory. However, when McPherson reaches that gap, he finds Confederate cavalry that's been posted there to reconnoiter. He loses his nerve and decides to pull back. Sherman cannot believe it. This opportunity has slipped through his fingers. And he tells McPherson afterwards, he says, "Well, Mac, you've missed your opportunity of a lifetime." Now Sherman's going to have to fight a battle at Resaca. Johnston is pulled back to that point. The last Federal troops to arrive there, Howard's 4th Corps, bringing up the rear. They go into position on the Confederate right. Before they have a chance to entrench, they're attacked by Hood's division and nearly swept off the field. Joe Hooker, who's in the center of the line, sends his 3 divisions northward to bail out Howard. And it's with the arrival of his troops and the firing of a lone Indiana battery that saves the day for Howard. So once again, Hooker has one on the luckless General Howard. Sherman manages to outflank Johnston's position at Resaca, and Johnston begins his retreat towards Atlanta. Next slide. The next major stopping point for Johnston's army is on a line at New Hope Church. For the first time in the Atlanta campaign, Sherman decides to leave his supply line on the Western Atlantic Railroad, gives his troops 20 days' rations in their wagons and on their haversacks, and sends them out to outflank Johnston's army. And it's at New Hope Church on May the 25th, 1864, that Joe Hooker will attack 3 divisions of Hood's Corps. And in the course of less than an hour, he'll take 1,600 casualties, launching a frontal assault on what Sherman thinks is the Confederate right flank, but is in fact the center of the Confederate line. Now at this point, conditions start to turn bad. The weather has been sunny, temperate. Now the rain begins to fall. It turns hot and humid. Clouds of insects plague the troops. Johnston once again pulls back to his next line. Sherman decides to launch a flank attack on the Confederate right at Pickett's Mill. You can just guess who will be defending that position. Cleburne's division. And it's General Howard who has the task of dislodging Cleburne's division from that point. Howard is put in command of a task force from the 4th Corps, the 14th Corps, and the 15th Corps. Now, Sherman has given him categorical orders to launch an attack. Once Howard gets to that position, he sees the Confederates well entrenched there. He has 3 choices at that point. He can conclude that that position is too strong to carry by an assault and pull back in disobedience to Sherman's orders. Or he can launch an all-out attack and attempt to drive the Confederates out through sheer force of numbers. Or he can take the 3rd choice, which is the one he decides to do, which is to attack piecemeal with 1 brigade at a time. In effect, a probing attack to test the strength of that Confederate position. That's what he does. He sends the brigade under the command of Brigadier General William B. Hazen on a frontal assault against Cleburne's division. There's a 21-year-old topographical engineer on Hazen's staff, Lieutenant Ambrose Bierce, who will go on to great fame as an author of The Devil's Dictionary, An Occurrence of Owl Creek Bridge, which Kurt Vonnegut calls the greatest American short story. It's also a pretty good movie, too.
Yeah.
Now, Bierce also wrote a nonfiction article about this attack. He calls it The Crime at Pickett's Mill. He holds several generals responsible for the debacle that occurs there. One of them is General Howard for ordering the attack. Next slide. And you can get an idea of what this attack must have looked like on the ground just by taking a look at this tactical map. You have Hazen's brigade down here all alone attacking Cleburne's division, while the rest of Howard's task force is back in a safer distance, lending their support, firing on the Confederates, but not moving forward. So for over 45 minutes, Hazen's troops are forced to fight it out on their own. If you could go back to that previous slide, Larry. And according to Bierce, this is literally how close the fighting was at one stage in that battle. Hazen's men are so close that after the attack fails, they're all huddled in a ravine at the base of this hill, and they have to wait until nightfall to pull back. But once they do, they leave over 500 of their comrades behind, killed and severely wounded. This is the crime at Pickett's Mill, as far as Bierce is concerned, that this attack even took place. But it proves that Howard may not be a good tactician, but he does follow orders. He's a team player. Next slide. And we'll move on to the next one. Now, as if that's not bad enough, the Confederates pull back to the Pine Mountain, Lost Mountain, and Brush Mountain line, putting them about 40 miles northwest of Atlanta, Sherman's final objective. And it's at a place called Gilgal Church, where Hooker's 20th Corps once again meets with its nemesis, none other than Cleburne's division. These guys happen to be everywhere. Butterfield, the 3rd Division commander in the 20th Corps, launches an attack and loses over 500 troops in a matter of minutes. Same old story. Another division under General Geary attacks. Same result. They're repulsed. Once again, Sherman decides to outflank Johnston's army. Johnston falls back to his strongest position yet on the Kennesaw mountain line. Next slide. It's during that advance that Sherman decides he's going to try another probing attack. He's going to advance the 23rd Corps under Schofield, the 20th Corps under Hooker, along the Powder Springs Road, try to outflank Johnston's position, steal a march to Marietta, which will put him within 30 miles of Atlanta. Johnston receives word from his cavalry. The Federals are attempting a flank attack. So Johnston takes Hood's entire corps from the extreme right of his line and sends it marching southward through Marietta to stop that Federal flank attack. And once Hood arrives at a place called Cobb's Farm, he sees the Federals in position. He thinks that Hooker's 20th Corps is the extreme right of the Union line. He doesn't even see Schofield's troops. And then 2 regiments of skirmishers, one from Hooker's 20th Corps and one from Schofield's 23rd Corps, advance into an open field. Hood doesn't say so in his report. He actually tried to say as little about this battle as he possibly could. It was an embarrassment to him. But I'm assuming that Hood thought that he was being attacked by the Federals and that this was just the first wave of an all-out flank attack. Well, Hood's attitude is, taken from his mentor, General Robert E. Lee of the Army of Northern Virginia, the best defense is a good offense. So he launches an open field assault with 2 of his divisions, across a field that's almost a mile long. Federal artillery and infantry of Hooker's 20th Corps are waiting. To within about 300 yards, they open fire. The artillery cuts Hood's men to pieces. One Union battery alone fired 669 rounds into the Confederates. And those who are able hit the dirt. Others are not so lucky. By the end of this battle, Hood will have sustained over 1,000 casualties. And the reason that he didn't know that Federal artillery was out there is he sent no skirmishers forward. So, incompetent tacticians are not a monopoly in the Union Army. Confederates have their share of them as well. Well, General Sherman is frustrated. If nothing else, Hood has convinced Sherman that this flanking business isn't really working. So he decides he's going to attempt a frontal assault. And as he had hoped to do at Snake Creek Gap, end this campaign in one decisive battle. He's convinced that Johnston's line, which stretches for 8 miles along Kennesaw Mountain, Big Kennesaw, Little Kennesaw, Pigeon Hill, is stretched too thin. All he has to do is hit it several different points, and he'll achieve a breakthrough. Well, he designates June 27, 1864 as the day of his attack. Next slide. And let's move on to the next one. He's going to attack with elements of the 15th Corps up to the north, the 4th Corps under Howard in the center, and then to the south, the 14th Corps. Howard will send in one division under John Newton as the spearhead of this attack. One of Newton's brigades is commanded by this young fellow, 26-year-old Brigadier General Charles G. Harker. Now, Howard remembered him from his days as a mathematics instructor at West Point. He said that Harker was the most promising of the cadets who were there during his tenure. And once Harker became one of his brigade commanders, Howard said, "I always knew that when Harker went in, he would get the job done." Well, this time, Harker is not successful. He rides out the head of his troops, who are massed in a formation of columns, on a fine white charger. Well, the result is all too painfully obvious for Harker's men. Within minutes, Harker is mortally wounded and sent tumbling off his horse. The attack soon breaks down. Worse yet, the dry undergrowth catches fire, and many of the wounded from the 4th Corps are consumed by the flames. Hearing the shrieks, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Martin, a Confederate officer from the 1st and 15th Arkansas Infantry, can't bear it. He stands up on the parapet in the midst of a hot fire and starts waving a handkerchief as a token for a flag of truce to buy time for the bringing off of the Federal wounded. Harker is carried back and dies that afternoon. Well, this attack is no success at any other point. Sherman has to call it off. But he's still willing to try again. And he sends several dispatches to General Thomas, who is in the center of the position and has been up close and personal. And Thomas's advice is categorical. 1 or 2 more such assaults would ruin this army. So Sherman decides he's going to attempt another flanking maneuver against Johnston's army. And it just so happens that General Schofield's 23rd Corps is already moving around the Confederate left flank, driving Johnston ever closer to Atlanta. And by the middle of July 1864, the Army of Tennessee is moving into position, the entrenchments ringing the city. It's on July 17, 1864, that Confederate President Jefferson Davis decides he's had enough. He replaces Johnston with one of his corps commanders, General John Bell Hood, and Hood knows what's expected of him. Next slide. In the course of the middle and late July, Hood will launch 3 sorties, 3 attacks on the Union Army. By far the largest of those 3 attacks takes place on July 22nd, the Battle of Atlanta. It's in that attack that Hood hopes to get around into the rear of McPherson's Army of the Tennessee and drive it away from Atlanta. But Hood has a propensity for expecting too much of his men. He takes Hardee's Corps, which is exhausted from 3 days of almost continual fighting on little or no food and sleep, and orders them to march through the streets of Atlanta to Decatur, Georgia, about 15 miles east of the city. Well, by noon of the 22nd, Howard's exhausted troops have only gone about halfway to that point. It's hot and humid, and Hood decides to launch the attack from there. In the afternoon of the 22nd of July, Hardee launches his flanking attack, striking the Army of the Tennessee. None other than Cleburne's division finds a gap in the line between the 17th Union Corps and the 16th Corps, and they begin to pour through that gap. And it just so happens that General McPherson and an aide have been riding along that part of the line. The Confederates in the lead see them. They call out to the 2 Federals to surrender. McPherson says nothing. He just tips his hat, spurs his horse, and attempts to ride off. And he's shot down and dies soon afterward. Now the Federals along that line have to fight it out the best they can. This is the high water mark of that Confederate assault, taking place on the Federal Center in the afternoon of July 22nd. It's a scene out of the Atlanta cyclorama, fighting around the Troop Howard House, the Troop Hurt House. The battery you see here, 4 guns of DeGrasse's battery, overrun. Sherman himself, a former artillerist, orders 5 batteries from the 23rd Corps to open fire. And then his best move of the day, next slide. The slide after that. His best move of the day, he places General John A. Logan in temporary command of the Army of the Tennessee and orders him to launch a counterattack. And Logan does just that with 5 brigades from the 15th Corps. And by 5 o'clock on the afternoon of July 22nd, after bitter fighting, Logan succeeds in stitching together the Union line, resulting in a Union victory and the bloodiest day during the Atlanta campaign. Over 5,500 Confederate casualties compared to roughly 3,600 Confederate casualties. To give you an idea of the beating that these 2 armies are taking, I should point out the Confederates are taking a much greater beating. Hood is losing casualties at twice the rate that Sherman is. And at the start of Hood's tenure, Sherman outnumbers Hood almost 2 to 1. I'm no mathematician, but those numbers do not look good for the Confederates. And they aren't. Hood will lose the city of Atlanta, the Battle of Jonesboro on the 1st of September, 1864, and have to fall back. Next slide. In the meantime, Sherman has a decision to make. He has to replace the fallen McPherson with a permanent commander of the Army of the Tennessee. The first choice, John Logan, long association with the Army of the Tennessee, almost from its very beginnings. He's much loved by the troops, but a fatal flaw in the eyes of Sherman and other professional soldiers. He's not a West Pointer. He's a political general, probably the best political general in the Union Army, but he's a mere civilian in uniform. So Sherman X's him out. Then there's Joe Hooker, who I should point out has been on Sherman's S list for most of the campaign. I should mention that Hooker has a certain penchant for hyperbole. It was at the Battle of Cobb's Farm that he had told Sherman that he was being attacked by 3 Confederate corps. Well, Sherman said 3 corps. Now let's see, how many corps does Johnston have? 3. Well, what are all those other Confederate soldiers doing out there? Well, in his memoirs, Sherman recalls that he took Hooker to task. He met him at a farmhouse, and the two had it out. And I think it was that day that Sherman decided that by hook or by crook, he was going to get rid of Hooker. No pun intended. And he saw his opportunity here, because Hooker has all the apparent qualifications. I should point out that if it hasn't become obvious by now, the 20th Corps has been the tip of the spear of the Union Army group marching through Georgia. Hooker gets a lot of the nasty, dirty jobs, having to drive the Confederates away. And all too often, they run into the strongest combat troops in what's now Hood's Army, Cleburne's division. In addition to that, Hooker has all the qualifications. He's a West Point graduate, and he outranks every other general in Sherman's army, with the exception of Sherman and Thomas. And that includes Howard. But, as Howard points out, or rather Thomas points out about Howard, he says, you cannot do better than put Howard in command. He is tractable. We can get along with him. I put the emphasis on him because Thomas left it unsaid. But you can tack on 2 words. Unlike Hooker. Thomas has had his fill of Hooker as well, because Hooker has operated his 20th Corps almost as an independent command. He picks whatever road he chooses to march on, often getting in front of other armies, including Thomas's own corps. So Hooker has once again made himself unwelcome. Now, this is unsupportable, the fact that Howard is now going to command the Army of the Tennessee. This is the man who lost the Battle of Chancellorsville for Hooker. He cannot abide this, so he resigns. And he gives up his last combat command of the war. So what happens to Howard from here on out? Next slide. Well, Hooker's last chance at the spotlight occurs during Lincoln's funeral procession at Springfield, Illinois, which Hooker leads. In 1866, he's mustered out of the Volunteer Army. 1868, he retires from the U.S. Army. Soon afterwards, he succumbs to a severe stroke, which virtually incapacitates him. And he dies in 1879. Howard's career turns out to be a much greater success. After the Atlanta campaign, he goes on to lead the Army of the Tennessee on the March to the Sea, the Carolinas campaign, and he's in North Carolina when General Johnston surrenders the largest Confederate force of the war. After the war, Howard goes on to head the Freedmen's Bureau, becomes a co-founder of Howard University in Washington, D.C. And as if that's not enough, he becomes a great Indian fighter. Although I'm sure some people would put great in quotation marks, because Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce Indians give him all the trouble he can handle. But Howard goes on to retire 1894 and lives on into the 20th century, 1909. Well, I'd like to close with a few observations about the nature of command in Union armies. Let's start with the Western Theater, where Hooker and Howard finally enjoy their first real success of the war. And why is that? Well, the most obvious reason is because Robert E. Lee is not there. Elements of Lee's army are, but that's a very different proposition. And the fact that General Longstreet and General Hood have served under Lee doesn't count either. Unfortunately for the South, they could not clone Robert E. Lee. And all they could do is come up with a pale comparison. That was John Bell Hood, who merely succeeded in wrecking the Army of Tennessee, Franklin, and Nashville in late 1864. Now, we have something else to consider: the nature of Corps command in the Civil War. I would submit that it was a good thing that even though Logan was probably definitely was a better combat commander than Howard, certainly I would say a better combat commander than Hooker. I think it was a good thing that Logan remained in command of the 15th Corps and Howard moved up. Now keep in mind, Howard is a good team player. He's shown that repeatedly, especially at Pickett's Mill, the greatest tactical miscue of his career. But I would say that was a good thing because Howard was moved out of the highest position of tactical responsibility in Civil War armies. Corps Command, you're still involved in the decisions about where to put your troops, when to strike, and in how strong a force. John Logan was an excellent tactical commander. Probably the other man who would vie for best political general, Jacob Cox, I put him in the same league. But let's look at some of the Army commanders that were in Sherman's Army group. We'll start with General Sherman himself. He is no great shakes as a tactician, as he proved at Chickasaw Bayou in 1862, and then later at Missionary Ridge in November of 1863. He's just too cautious, and as a result, he repeatedly fails. Second, we have John Schofield, the commander of the Army of the Ohio. Schofield has had only one real battlefield command before the Atlanta campaign. He was chief of staff for Nathaniel Lyon at Wilson's Creek in August of 1861. He's pretty much just been a bureaucrat after that. And to Schofield's credit, he has the good sense to leave his best subordinate, Jacob Cox, in command in the Battle of Franklin. And it's Cox who engineers the Federal victory there. And then finally, General Howard, the man who committed the crime at Pickett's Mill, as Bierce would say. Howard moved up to a position where he's no longer directing troops. So he's been moved out of the loop. So I would say that we have kind of a weird sort of riff on the Peter principle. You might remember that you keep moving people up until they reach a point where they're no longer competent. Well, I think it was a good thing that you had generals like Howard at Army Command, so the real tacticians, the men like Logan and Cox, can do the real fighting. Thank you very much. Yeah, questions? Yeah, Bruce.
What did the middle-level officers of the Army of the Cumberland think about having an Easterner put in Corps Command and obviously displacing one of their own in command of the 4th Corps?
Well, I think they probably felt very similarly to the way that Sigel's troops felt, the 11th Corps. Howard was unwelcome. But there's a big difference, though, because in the Army of the Cumberland, they turn out to be a much more successful command than the 11th Corps and the Army of the Potomac. And I think victory is something of a panacea. And Howard proved to be, I would say, a sort of a bland personality, but if anything, he was inoffensive. And he gradually worked his way into at least grudging acceptance by his subordinates and by his troops. So although he was never a popular general, in the sense that someone like Hancock or Logan would be considered popular, he at least was acceptable. And he also had the good sense, as a final gesture at Sherman's suggestion, the Grand Review of Washington, D.C., rather than march at the head of the Army of the Tennessee, as was his right, he yielded to General Logan and let General Logan hold that position. But of course, Logan bore a grudge long after the war for what Sherman had done to him by replacing him with Howard. He became a formidable foe in the halls of Congress and a great enemy of West Point and West Pointers. Yes?
I've always been puzzled by, in the campaign for Atlanta, General Johnston, at one point, with the protection of these little fortifications known as chupets. And I was wondering, I've always wondered why he didn't make greater use of them and why he eventually retreated from them all.
Well, the man who those Choupets were named for, Brigadier General Francis Choupe, would probably ask the same question. Now, Choupe had designed these fortifications along the Chattahoochee River as a stopping point, and they were a formidable line of entrenchments. Choupe's plan, his intent, was to put a relatively small part of Johnston's army in those fortifications, which they could hold, freeing up the rest of Johnston's army to act offensively. Well, Johnston went against the intent of the Choupets. He actually fortified with a much more crude line of fortifications and put virtually his entire army within those entrenchments, defeating the purpose of the Choupets, which the Federals soon outflanked. So much to Choupe's chagrin, the works that he'd spent weeks developing and then building came to naught, and they're just a spot on a Civil War trail in Georgia. Never served the purpose for which they were intended.
Do we know why General Johnston did this?
Well, my thinking is that Johnston decided that he was going to entrench his entire army simply because he felt that it would be more secure to oppose Sherman from a position of strength behind those entrenchments. I don't think he understood the intent that Choupe had. Somewhere along the line there was a disconnect. And Johnston never understood that the whole point behind them was to free some of Johnston's army to act as an attacking or an assault force. Yes?
That would have taken my days.
How did Hooker get command of the 11th and 12th Corps? It's only 3 months after Chancellorsville. I mean, do they regard him as a better Corps commander than an Army commander? Or?
Well, my feeling is that President Lincoln had a lot of respect for Hooker's bravery and his fighting qualities. And he was able to look past his flaws as an Army commander and really as a subordinate, because he had pointed out that Hooker had really tried to besmirch the reputations of some honorable soldiers, including McClellan and Burnside. But I think there was still enough confidence that Hooker could take on the position of Corps commander that they were willing to give him a chance. And in fairness to Hooker, he turned out to be a good Corps commander. The only problem is that he played according to his own rules and chose not. Well, we'll say he listened to Sherman when it proved convenient.
Any more? No? Well, thank you very much for an excellent talk.